Hi, Ben Johnson here to record day 3 of our Excel class. Go ahead and navigate to our website, which is bit.ly/psdexcel, bit.ly/psdexcel. There you'll find our pivot table projects, which is primarily what we worked on during day 3. Go ahead and download that file, save it to a location where you can find it, and then open it from the bottom of your browser or wherever you saved it to. All right, pivot tables, in my opinion, are probably the number one on my list of skills to learn, just because it can save you so much time and energy. Basically, a pivot table will take a lot of records like you have on my screen here, 382, and summarize those records for you quickly and automatically without having to write any formulas or functions. So in order to use a pivot table, you have to start out first with a well-designed spreadsheet, headings on the top, no blank columns or rows, otherwise it will stop when it hits blank. So try not to leave any rows or columns blank. Typically these will be spreadsheets that you download from a student information system or a state database, although they could be things that you would type in on your own. But to make a pivot table, you just want to start in cell A1. That way the pivot table will guess correctly where it's located at. And then you just go to your insert ribbon pivot table. As long as you started in A1, it should guess the location correctly. And so in this case it did. If it didn't, I could use my mouse at this point and highlight the correct table. One other thing to note, if you know you'll be adding records to your table, you can go ahead and increase this bottom number, say to 500 or 1,000, so that you make sure that any of your new records that you add will be included. So just again, add more rows to the bottom of this table if you anticipate having more records. Then I'll hit OK. This takes me to the pivot table screen. It's a little intimidating at first, but the good news is that it's super easy to use. Over here are all of your headings, and you need to decide which one is the most important heading. And in this case, I think team is sort of the category you'd most likely separate by. And I usually recommend dragging that into rows. So you'll see what happens when I drag team into rows here. It quickly summarizes all the teams. The reason that I like to use rows is if I drag it into columns, it's just going to be harder to print, harder to see. So given the choice, I'll usually use rows instead of columns here. Then whatever you want to add up, you'll drag into values. So typically salary would be a number that you'd want to add. Now it doesn't format it in currency, so if you right click on sum of salary here, you can go to number format and just change that to currency with no decimal places, and that's just going to be easier to read. Now the neat thing about pivot tables is that I can further summarize that data by dragging position below the team. And so now not only do I have a nice subtotal for the team, but also by position. And this is sort of the purpose of a pivot table. It's just to quickly summarize data without having to write formulas or functions. Huge time saver. Now, it could be misleading that pitchers and outfielders are paid a lot more than the other positions. Well, that's because this is a sum of salary. If you'd like to, you can right click on this and you can go to summarize values by average, and that gives you a more accurate idea of what each of the positions is paid on average. So it's easy to change that from summarize values by sum to summarize values by average, or you could look at max values, or you could look at minimum values, so you can get those answers very quickly, and that's the power of the pivot table. Now you don't have to necessarily sum or average salaries. You could simply count those. So if I go to summarize values by count, this is actually a count of, but we'll need to change the format, so I'll right click, go to number format, and just change that back to a number. And so now I have an idea of how many players are in each position. So you could count salaries also. Um, Now, let's take a look at another table. Maybe this time we'll look at cars. And again, selecting A1, insert pivot table, OK. In this case, maybe make is the most important. And then maybe that's followed by model. And then in stock would be the number that we would want to calculate. So we would put that in values. And then I want to show you how you could use this columns. If I drag color into columns, it makes a matrix. And as long as there aren't too many different types of colors or makes or models, feel free to go ahead and use that columns because it will still fit nicely on a single page when you go to print it. And that's why this is called a pivot table. It's just very quick and easy to pivot things around within that table. So it's just going to require a little of experimenting until you get the look that you're after. The only field that we've not yet used is the filters field. And so I'll just go ahead and drag transmission into that filters. And so now if we want to, we can just look at automatic. And that's a nice way to use the filter field. And so here you can see all 4 of these areas being used in this pivot table. There's no hard and fast rule on pivot tables. It's basically a matter of you playing around and experimenting until you come up with the look that you're after. The most important thing with pivot tables is just knowing to right click to change the number format, or to summarize values by average or count. Those are all common things that you'll want to do. In terms of the looks of the pivot table, you can always come here to design, and you can pick a different style of table if you'd like, if you're not satisfied with that other look. And then there's some different ways that you can show your pivot table, so feel free to experiment with some of those settings. If you added more records, you would come back to the Analyze and you would hit this refresh button, and then your new totals would come up. So they're really actually pretty easy to use, but most people don't know about them because they're usually not taught until you take an advanced class. But they're actually quite simple to use, so it's a good tool for you to know about. And they're most useful when you have lots of records that you need to make sense of. The more records you have, the more powerful the pivot table becomes. And so you can just look at this sheet and explore some more of the records that I have here. I went to sales, insert pivot table. And again, here you would just need to decide, what's your most important item to sort by, next most important, and finally what you want to summarize here. And then just know that you can change those to dollar figures by right-clicking number format, currency. All right, now you can easily make charts with this. So if I come up to the top of my Analyze ribbon, I can go to Pivot Chart. I can pick a particular type of chart, and it'll automatically and quickly make that chart for me. So I'll just go ahead and make a bar chart here. Okay. So pivot charts, they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and so you can quickly see here who had the most sales by country, and easily who had the least sales by country very quickly. So do take advantage of the pivot chart in addition to the pivot table itself. But again, just a really nice way to quickly summarize lots of data. Too often I'll see people print tables like this and bring them to meetings. I would argue that that's a waste of everyone's time. Instead, spend a few minutes, make a nice pivot table like I've got here, maybe even a pivot chart, print that off, take that to your meeting. It's going to be much more useful for people to understand what's in the table. So that's a quick lesson on pivot tables and pivot charts. In my opinion, probably the most important thing to learn in Excel.